Today I'm going to test out the 17 to 28mm Tamron f2.8 for astrophotography. So I was able to get out before we went into lockdown, and I was able to test out the 17 to 28mm Tamron Sony FE mount for astrophotography. We got to a Bortle 3 location and there was a little bit of light pollution on the horizon in a few directions, but I wanted to see how good it was to photograph the stars. Even though the focal range is a little bit limited compared to the G Master 16 to 35mm, it seemed much lighter and makes for a great travel lens. Now I'm used to using a manual focusing lens for astrophotography. Once you become used to them, you know where the infinity point is. And sometimes it's not where the lens says it is. However, with this lens, it doesn't have any lens markings for focal distances and it's focused by wire, meaning it's an electronic focusing system. Whereas in a fully manual lens, this is mechanical and more importantly repeatable when you put it in a certain position. So focusing is a challenge. But when you put it into the manual focusing mode, it does come up with the focusing scale on the back of the camera. I found that in finding a star, then using the magnify tool to get a crop of that star, you can focus on it quite easily with the focusing ring. And because of that f2.8, you should be able to see the brighter stars or the planets to be able to focus on. With the focal distance limited to 17mm, it did seem a little bit limiting compared to my 14mm I used to own. However, this shouldn't be too much of a problem because it's quite easy to do a pano and stitch those images together if you want a wider shot. If you're wondering how to do that, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description to another of my videos. Having the variation on focal length from 17 to 28mm does really come in handy, as you can really work on your composition without having to change lenses. If you want to get closer, it's just a case of zooming in instead of swapping out those lenses. Now this is really important in really harsh conditions, like the desert where I've been shooting a lot of my tutorials recently. Now the aperture of f2.8 is adequate for astrophotography, but it's obviously not as good as the faster prime lenses. So this is the main trade-off with this lens. And if you want more light, getting a tracker is always a relatively cheap option or an alternative way of getting more light into your camera. At 2.8, if you zoom in 1:1, you can see some coma aberrations, but they're nothing major. And when you look at the image as a whole, when it fills your whole screen, these are so subtle that I'd be quite happy using it at f2.8. Whereas with some other lenses, you do have to stop the aperture down to actually get a usable image. Here's an example of bad coma aberrations. And here is the 17 to 28mm at 17mm, so you can see there are almost none visible, especially when looking at the image as a whole instead of 1:1. If you edit in Lightroom, it automatically corrects the vignette and distortion, but when you remove these lens corrections, you can really see how much this lens vignettes at all focal lengths. I was surprised by how much. Also, you can see the amount of distortion when switching this on and off. So if I flick between the two, you can really see the change in distortion and especially that change in the vignette. Lightroom does do a good job at correcting this, but it does have a heavy vignette. All in all, this is a fantastic lens that does a great job for astrophotography. It's not quite as good as some of the faster prime lenses, but there's always going to be a bit of a trade-off between owning a few prime lenses and owning a zoom. And this brings me to the price. For well under $1,000, it is a fantastic lens. It covers a few key focal lengths and everything in between. And even though it doesn't go all the way to 35mm, it still has quite a good range. If you're after one wide lens and had a limited budget, I'd go for this. However, if you were getting properly into astrophotography, I'd save your money and get some dedicated manual primes, like the Laowa 15mm f2, or maybe the Sony GM24 1.4. Now that last one isn't a manual lens, but it is actually a fantastic lens for astrophotography. And at f1.4, it lets in so much light. Now, as I've already mentioned, if you don't have the budget for these more expensive lenses, getting a tracker is always an option, as the Tamron 17 to 28mm and a Star Adventure tracker would be cheaper than just the 24mm f1.4 prime from Sony. It all depends on which route you want to go down really. I'm a prime shooter and I've been pleasantly surprised by this lens. I'm still saving for the Laowa 15mm f2, but for now this will do just fine. Now if you like this video, try clicking on this next one to learn how to photograph the stars, or click on this one down here to learn about stacking your shots for cleaner images. And if you haven't already, subscribe for photography tutorials and reviews every Monday and Thursday. I'll see you next time.